Hello, my geeslings. It is Mother Goose, Robinson Earhart, with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 43. This is a first as far as introductions go. I am wet because it has been raining here for months in Palo Alto, seemingly without end, and for that reason, Pins, for the first time, is not on my lap for this introduction. But here she comes. Maybe she will be joining me. Anyway, I also just had a pint of ice cream for breakfast, and that adds to my shivering coldness. But this episode is with Eric Schwitzgebel, professor of philosophy at UC Riverside, and it was an extremely fun conversation, to say the least. It was quite bang, bang, bang. He's really lively and full of all sorts of interesting thoughts, fun topics. He writes about an incredibly, and I'd say unprecedentedly wide variety of material, as you'll hear. And in this conversation, we talk about an upcoming book of his about the weirdness of the world and the philosophy of weirdness. So we talk about why, if you're a materialist, the US might be conscious. We talk about what Kant and Cyberpunk have in common. We talk about evidence for an external world, whether ethicists are more ethical than other people, other philosophers, just anyone you see on the street. We One of the more fascinating and surprisingly thrilling things we get into is snail sex. And I didn't know that this could be fascinating. I don't think that I got up the morning that we had this conversation expecting to talk much about snail sex, but I'm glad we did. I listened to the conversation again before preparing to do the edits, and snail sex is quite enthralling. I'll just leave it at that. So I think you are really going to enjoy this podcast. Like I said, it was just so fun to talk to Eric, and I'm already really looking forward to having him on again at some point so that we can get into the more of the near endless content he writes, because he's just a prolific author. So, without any further ado, from Pins and I, or me, from Pins and me, enjoy this episode. So you write about a ridiculously wide variety of topics.
I'm afraid so, yeah.
Yeah, so because of this, I suspect that our conversation is going to be uniquely disjointed compared to the others that I have, but I think that's a good thing. It's new. But first off, though, so did you get into philosophy because it's a discipline uniquely suited to this? That you can write about, you can dip your toes into all the issues you want. You've got the tools for it.
That is a large part of why I got into philosophy. I thought for all X, you can basically do philosophy of X. So it's very free in terms of what you can pursue. As long as whatever question you want to pursue, as long as you pursue it in a certain kind of intellectual way that tries to get at the core fundamental issues, in my view, you're doing philosophy.
So I stumbled across a manuscript you're working on. I think it's going to be coming out relatively soon. The Weirdness of the World.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to say or to argue, as you do, that the world is fundamentally weird? And why is this a good thing?
Right. So I mean something in particular by weird. I mean, it gets used in a lot of ways, but I'm using a little bit as a technical term where something is weird if it defies our kind of expectations of what's normal and readily understood and fits with common sense.
So it defies like a folk theory.
Defies a folk theory, and is also difficult to understand. It defies understanding even beyond the folk theory, right? So it has to defy the folk theories for sure, but it also has to be in some way also epistemically elusive. So I use a different term, bizarre, for stuff that justifies folk theory but isn't otherwise elusive, right? So, for example, relativity theory, the twin paradox in relativity theory is this idea that time flows differently depending on what relative speed you're traveling at. It's actually even a little more complex than that, but we understand it quite well. Our satellites depend on it. It's very well confirmed. It's completely bizarre from a folk point of view, but it's not weird in the further sense that we really don't understand what's going on scientifically either,
Hmm.
except that it doesn't quite fit with quantum mechanics. And that's weird, actually. So then you get the weirdness when you try to fit relativity theory and quantum mechanics together. Then you get something that both defies common sense and just like we don't know what's going on.
That leads me to wonder then, will all of the current weirdness eventually just collapse into bizarreness? So the world is ultimately not going to be weird to us forever.
I don't think that's right. So there's this analogy that's often attributed to Einstein, but in fact, I don't think he said it, which is that as the circle of light grows bigger, the circle of darkness grows bigger around it. I think there are things that used to be weird that became merely bizarre and now aren't even bizarre, like the fact that the Earth is not in the center of the universe. Right? The idea that the Earth moved, when Copernicus proposed it, it was bizarrely contrary to common sense. It didn't really fit with our current astronomical understandings. There wasn't a compelling astronomical evidence in favor of it. Right? Eventually, it became bizarre in the sense that it still didn't fit with common sense. But once Galileo and Kepler got their thing going, it was like, yeah, okay, the scientific consensus it favors it. And now people don't even find it all that strange, right? So particular issues can move from being weird to being merely bizarre to being not even bizarre. But the idea that there won't always be stuff beyond our understanding, that doesn't strike me as likely. I think, one way of thinking about it is, to think about the 2-year-old's annoying why questions, right? The 2-year asks you something. Well, why is the sky blue? Right? And you give your best attempt at a scientific answer, and the 2-year-old says, why? Right? And the 2-year-old says, why? And this 2-year-old can keep backing up with why questions. The deeper your understanding goes, the more of those why questions you can answer, but eventually you're not going to run to the ground why, where there's no further why to ask, I think. There will always be something about the world and something about us that we're not going to be able to back away far enough to understand.
So I guess what I'm wondering then, is this a time thing? So we won't last long enough to explain all of the things, or there are questions that are outside the capacity of science to answer and thus move from the realm of weird to bizarre?
It's not a time thing as I'm seeing it. Now, I should say that this particular thing that we're talking about right now, I don't develop in detail as an argument in the book. I gesture
Okay.
at it a little bit, but so I haven't fully developed my detailed answer on this. But it's not in my view a time thing, and it's not even that there are particular questions that I think necessarily elude science, as it's almost more like a transcendental thing, in the sense that any knowledge you have, here's another way you can think about it in terms of the classic Agrippin trilemma, right? Any knowledge you have is
I'm sorry, the classic what dilemma?
Agrippin trilemma. Do you know this?
No, I don't.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, I
I'd
mean,
love to.
even if you pretended that, even if you said you knew it, your listeners might not, right? So the idea is,
Yeah, yeah.
anything that you say, anything that you claim, if you try to defend it, well, you got basically three options. You can either just assert it undefended, or you can defend it by appealing to something else, or but then you raise the same question again. Okay, so why is that thing? What do you do in support of that thing? Right? You can either give it undefended, or you can pull up something else in support, or you can argue in a circle. Right? So there's a trilemma. All
Yeah.
arguments ultimately will either be circular, ground out in something undefended, or just regress infinitely.
I like that. That's nice and clean.
Right. So whatever scientific knowledge or philosophical knowledge we come to, at some point, we're going to have to say, well, we're just taking that as an assumption. I can't really explain it more. Or we're going to just get caught pursuing that regress and pursuing it and pursuing it and pursuing it, or we're going to tie ourselves in a circle. And the circle really ultimately is going to be some kind of ungrounded thing too. So the thought that I have here is that in some, we can call it transcendental to make it sound fancy, right? In some transcendental
Sure.
sense, we're not ever going to be able to understand the grounds and explanation of everything. There's going to be the grounds of the grounds of the grounds of the grounds, and eventually we're going to poop out. It's not just because we're going to get tired or go extinct or something like that. There's just something about the process that's inexhaustible.
Okay. No, I like that answer. Now, just for my own edification, it's the Grippin trilemma.
Agrippin, Agrippan, after Agrippa.
And
He was
who
a
is that?
medieval, I think. I tried to find his writings at one point to try to get back to the original source of the Agrippin trilemma, and I can't remember. This was a long time ago, but
I found him. Agrippa was a Pyrrhonist philosopher who probably lived toward the end of the first century.
yeah, okay, so late
Okay,
antiquity. But
cool.
we don't have his writings. He's kind of, as far as I remember, just basically famous for this trilemma. Yeah.
All right. Well, great. We've started off very well. I've learned something quite fascinating. So now, to talk more about some particular issues in your book, why, if materialism is true, is the United States probably conscious? My guess is that this has something to do with functionalism, which I know a little bit about from Ned Block. But why don't we start with maybe just briefly? I think materialism will be pretty easy for you to sum up and then move from there.
Right. Well, materialism is actually not that easy to sum up. There have been various attempts to define it, and it turns out to be actually pretty tricky to define. But we can gesture toward it, right?
Sure, sure. I mean, all things are material, but then there is the question. I mean, what is is a
What
field
is material? Yeah,
material?
exactly. Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
the way that I like to think of materialism is it's the view. If you think about quarks, protons, electrons, photons, magnetic fields, stuff like that, right? Materialism is the view that the universe is fundamentally composed of stuff like that and the things that compose it or interact with it in a way that is not fundamentally mental, right?
Okay.
So decades ago, we might have said, protons, electrons, neutrons, everything's composed of that. That's it. Story's over. Right now, it's going to be more complex than that, but it's some version of that is materialism. And then you have to build into that that these things are not fundamentally mental, or you get some views that end up being technically materialism that we wouldn't want to call materialism, right? So you got this
Okay. So
non-mental kind of little stuff, or either particles or fields or strings or whatever, that kind of is not fundamentally mental and interacts in some way, and then all of our mental lives arise from that. So that's materialism.
okay.
And then the central thought of that chapter is that if you look at what materialists say about how conscious experience arises out of the interactions of these fundamental things, the United States basically satisfies all the kinds of criteria that are normally appealed to. So, why is it that brains are conscious, right? So, well, they do a lot of complex information processing. So does the United States. Well, in order to really understand this thesis, we need to think a little carefully about what I mean by the United States. By the United States, I don't mean the government. I don't mean some abstract
Hmm.
thing. I mean like the concrete entity that is all the people of the United States as parts, kind of like the cells of your body constitute you as parts, right? So imagine all the people of the United States as residents and citizens. Each of them are part of this spatially distributed large thing, like group entity, right? That thing does a lot of information processing, a lot of exchange. It behaves in all kinds of ways with its environment. It imports goods. It regulates its smoggy exhalations. It announces its position on foreign affairs. It engages in wars. When it engages in wars, it seems to deploy sensory capacities. Right? The army doesn't crash into the mountain; it goes around it. Right? It speaks. It represents itself. It's got really complex self-representations. It is. I mean, if you think about what, like, if we think rabbits are conscious, as most people do, right?
Hmm.
What does a rabbit brain have that the United States doesn't have?
There are a couple things that immediately come to mind. Again, since it's a rabbit, we're going to have to be a bit presumptuous, but a rabbit, I assume, has some sort of narrative center, even if it's not linguistic the way ours is.
Hmm.
But I imagine that the rabbit is sort of it it sees itself or feels itself located in a kernel somewhere behind its eyes. And I
Maybe.
don't yeah,
Well, the United
yeah,
States
it's
is located on North America. I mean, it's a big thing, so it's not going to be
mhm,
located in any narrow location, right? But it's located on Earth in
sure.
North America.
I don't I can imagine though it's not so much I didn't mean to draw location into
Yeah.
this point because I can imagine a conscious artificially intelligent creature that is disembodied but still has maybe uh, a narrative sense of self. It doesn't need to necessarily be instantiated in one point, but that's one difference that I see
Mm.
between the rabbit and the United States. And then one other thing is that all the other conscious creatures that we know of, I mean, chief among them ourselves, do have a very clean spatial delimitation to what the brain is and what we think is the subject of consciousness. Whereas the United States is this very discrete conglomeration of things that, I mean, pretty much everything within the skull, I can really say, okay, this is part of the of Robinson's brain, but I can't necessarily point to everything within the United States and even imagine how these things would play some role in consciousness. But
Yeah, well, I mean, there's stuff in your brain that you might not think plays a role in consciousness. I mean, to what extent
no, you're very right.
do the
That's a good
blood
point.
vessels, the linings of the blood vessels? I mean, they're important, but they're not the
Hmm.
neurons, right? Well, so the roads of the United States are important. They're not the people. I mean, from a broad point of view, you can say, well, the neurons, the blood vessels are part of your brain and part of the system that really gives rise to consciousness. And you might take a similarly broad
Hmm.
view of the roads in the United States, right? Or you could go more narrow and say, well, look, it's really about the neurons and the neural connections. Or in the United States, you could say it's really about the people that compose it. And so you can kind of go either way on that. On
Hmm.
on narrative, I'm not sure exactly how rich you mean it, but you know, do rabbits have a narrative sense of the self? Well, I don't know, but maybe in a weak sense at most. But then I'm not sure the United States doesn't. Also, I mean, the United States talks about its history, has plans for the future. I mean, it seems to.
Sure.
When the United
Maybe.
States
Okay.
scolds Iran for developing nuclear weapons or whatever, right? that's fitting into a whole history of its interactions with other organisms of its type.
Hmm. Maybe another word I might point to is there's some sort of phenomenology to being a rabbit, but I'm not sure that there's a phenomenology to being
Well,
the United
that's
States.
exactly the question, right?
Hmm.
So I use consciousness and phenomenology interchangeably. They mean the same thing in my term, right? So I think
Okay.
commonsensically, we'd say, no, of course the United States doesn't have phenomenology. But what I'm saying is, okay, well, what's the basis for having phenomenology according to materialists? Well, it's having stuff like lots of information exchange and intellectual and and intelligent information exchange with its environment, and maybe having some kind of narrative in a weak sense, a weak enough sense that we could include a rabbit, right? That kind of stuff is what is seems to be on most materialist accounts enough to have phenomenology, experience, something that's like consciousness. I use all these phrases equivalently. So why doesn't the United States have the same thing? We find it absurd. People think it. I mean, you maybe think it's absurd. It's obviously false, right? But I don't find it obviously false. Uh,
Okay.
yeah.
That no, that's great. That's what I was going to ask next. I listened to Kieran Setia's podcast, Five Questions, and he often asks his guests a question inspired by Iris Murdoch. Murdoch, do you believe the papers that you write or the arguments that you make? And I'm very curious. In this case, do you think that the United States is probably conscious?
Well, I'm not necessarily a materialist,
Okay.
so I am kind of ambivalent among three possible reactions. And where I'd put the weight among this ambivalence fluctuates depending on kind of what's salient or something. Um, but but all three of these reactions, I think, get a non-trivial portion of my credence. One is go for it, sure. Materialism is probably our best guess, and why not think that one surprising result of materialism is that you get group consciousness in an entity like the United States. I mean, boy, cosmology, physics, they're some pretty fundamentally surprising results there. The world is not necessarily like we commonsensically assume. Why couldn't that just be the case here? Right? If our best materialist theories say here's what you need for consciousness, and lo and behold, the United States has it, well, maybe that's just kind of like the twin paradox or the weirdness of quantum mechanics or whatever, right? So that's one reaction, one mood that I'm in sometimes. And another mood or another thing that I'm kind of aspect of the ambivalence or tribivalence is to say, okay, well, look, maybe materialism isn't right. I have it's my my favorite inclination or theory with respect to consciousness, but I'm not committed to it. And maybe this is just one of the unfortunate consequences that you get from committing to this false theory. And then the third thing, that the one that the materialists are you generally happiest to think of as the proper conclusion of this paper, which I think is definitely a reasonable thing that you could think is, well, think of it as a challenge. Maybe what's happened is materialist theories are not really well developed, right? Show me, develop materialists, a theory that delivers the appealing conclusion that humans are conscious, rabbits are conscious, space aliens of various plausible sorts are conscious. We didn't talk about that, but if you want a general theory, you're going to want a theory that applies to lots of hypothetical cases and delivers what seem to be the right results for those cases. Right. Gets you consciousness in all those right kinds of cases, but also doesn't get you U.S. consciousness. I mean, maybe the thing to do is develop that theory. Now, I don't know why we should take it as a fixed point in developing our theory of consciousness that, okay, we know for sure the United States, is not going to be conscious. If the theory implies that, just chuck it out. that would be a good fixed point to have if we had excellent epistemic reason for thinking that group consciousness was impossible. But as far as I can tell, our only real reason for thinking it's impossible is it's unintuitive, it's contrary to common sense, kind of doesn't seem right. But I mean, that's not really a compelling reason.
The next subject that I was curious about involves Kant, who I don't know nearly enough about. I mean, their philosophy, as you're well aware, is a huge subject, and we inevitably, even the 80-year-old emeritus professors who've been around for a long time have huge gaps, and Kant is definitely one of my gaps. Now, I also know very little about cyberpunk, other than I have a vague idea of what the aesthetic is.
Right.
So when I saw that you were writing or thinking about the similarities of Kant and cyberpunk, I was quite perplexed. Now, who or what? Maybe we should start here with what cyberpunk is.
Right. Well, the thing that your viewers will probably be most familiar with from cyberpunk is the Matrix. So lots of people.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, the Matrix
yeah.
is a classic cyberpunk movie.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Matrix is definitely, I mean, top 5 movies. I absolutely adore it.
Yeah. So I mean, in the history of science fiction, it got started in the mid '80s. Neuromancer by William Gibson is kind of like a very important central early piece of fiction that was seen as cyberpunk. And yeah, there's this kind of aesthetic to it, which isn't really relevant to the part of the picture that I'm drawing philosophically. But kind of what's one thing that's central to a lot of cyberpunk, including Gibson's Neuromancer and the Matrix, is that you can plug in to a reality that is what we now call a virtual reality, in which you can interact with people, and that is super important, and that in some ways might be more important to ordinary people than kind of what we think of as ordinary reality, right? So you can jack in, and you're interacting and living in a totally different kind of world that's created by computers, and you experience it directly, right? In the Matrix, that's the situation of ordinary people. They don't even know that they're living in this kind of illusory world, right? In Neuromancer, hackers intentionally kind of jack in to the Matrix so they can manipulate computer programs and hack in to security websites and stuff like that, right? So they know that they're in cyberspace, but that's the kind of idea. And then I can connect that up with Kant if you like, but that's the
please
right. So Kant is open to so many interpretations. So I am not a Kant specialist by any stretch, but I think it's within the realm of not unreasonable interpretations of Kant to think of it as having a certain kind of kinship with this cyberpunk idea of plugging into a virtual reality or the Matrix or cyberspace, right? And that is, the critique of pure reason, the transcendental aesthetic, sees space and time and causation as not fundamental features of things as they are in themselves, but rather as features that we bring to the world. So as a first pass version of the analogy here, you could kind of think of it as if we are creating our own cyberspace or our own matrix psychologically that we live in that doesn't really resemble fundamental reality as it is in itself.
Because the noumena is just inaccessible to us in principle.
Right. So the position that I call transcendental idealism, and I think Kant is the most important advocate of it, but I think you could be a transcendental idealist without being a Kantian down the line. the position I call transcendental idealism is committed to two things. One is that we don't know the fundamental nature of things as they are in themselves. And two, spatiality is a feature that we bring to the world. It depends on our minds. And if you accept those two things, then in my view, you're a transcendental idealist. And that would be an alternative position to materialism. In the materialist view, standardly, I think, right? Spatiality is a feature of things as they are in themselves. Now, this is where defining materialism gets a little complicated because, there are some physicists who think that spatiality arises from the informational features of things. And then, how materialist is that really? What do we mean by materialism exactly? But kind of your ordinary bread and butter materialist, protons, neutrons, fields, they're things that exist in space and have spatial properties, spatial location. So, if you want to spend a little more time on it, I can give it I can give it another twist and kind of bring it together a little bit better.
Please.
All right. So
please.
So the other twist is to think about the theory of computation, right? So the theory of computation goes back to Alan Turing in the 1930s. And there's nothing about computation that is inherently spatial, right? If you look closely at standard understandings of computation, you need states, you need transitions among states, you need symbols, right. You need those kinds of things, but you don't need space.
Entirely materially agnostic.
It's agnostic about materialism, right? So you could implement, and in the book I go through in detail how you could do this. You could implement a computer wholly in a non-spatial substance, like a Cartesian soul, right? If you think of Descartes, traditionally thought that souls, immaterial souls, existed in time but not in space. Right? Your soul is not located in the center of your head or something like that. It's not a spatial thing. It is a temporal thing. Right? So you could have an immaterial soul that engages in computation. Now, if you also hold that the mind is a computer or could be implemented by a computer, as many people hold, but not everybody holds, right? But a lot of people who like science fiction, think, well, robots could be conscious. That would be an example of a mind being implemented by a computer. Right? Now imagine it being implemented by by a non-spatial computer. What if all of reality is being implemented by a non-spatial computer, and we are just software programs, basically, inside that non-spatial computer? Right, so we're living in a matrix, or we're living in a simulation. The simulation, the matrix, is being implemented by a computer that is not fundamentally spatial. It's informational, maybe it's temporal, but it's not fundamentally spatial, right? Then you've got a kind of a fundamental reality that's just very different from how we ordinarily think, and to which we may not have any access really at all. Right. If you go down that path, you're not quite at Kant yet, but you're getting closer. That's kind of the idea here, right? I'm not saying it's true, but considering it as a possibility, I think, gets us interestingly close to Kant, using modern science fictional type concepts that a very different type of philosopher and person resonates with than normally resonates with 18th century philosophy. So if you go down that path, then you can start to see how, it might be the case that reality is not fundamentally spatial, that spatiality is just how our minds make sense of some fundamentally non-spatial thing that we don't really understand.
No, I very much see how the Matrix connects to this idea of there being an inaccessible reality. But the place where the Matrix itself no longer becomes the ideal example for this case is that you can become unplugged from the Matrix and leave the Matrix and enter the erstwhile inaccessible reality.
Right.
But I saw that there in your book you indicate that there is experimental evidence for the existence of an external world. And I had the sense, as I saw this chapter, that you were precisely referring to, not necessarily just a brain in a vat type case, but the idea that the world is a simulation. And if that is the case, if I'm on the right track, what is the experimental evidence for the existence of an external world? Why
Right.
do you find this Matrix picture convincing?
So to be clear about the aim in that chapter, the skeptical position that I'm aiming to refute in that chapter is the view that the only thing that exists in the entire cosmos, or at least the entire universe, is my own mind. So even if I'm in the Matrix, that's a strong form of solipsism. So even if I'm in the Matrix, solipsism would be wrong because something would exist other than my own mind, the computer. So in that chapter, all I'm trying to do is move from solipsism compatible premises to an anti-solipsistic conclusion. I haven't seen a philosopher who's really done that well and carefully. There have been attempts like Kant's Refutation of Idealism and Descartes' Meditations, but I think those arguments really don't quite work. Russell has done some stuff that I think is interesting, but also I think his arguments are kind of undeveloped and problematic. And there have been others, Fichte and others, but all I'm trying to do in that chapter is like, here I am with my stream of experiences. Can I somehow break through that stream and say something besides this stream of experience must exist? Maybe I don't have any idea what it is, but it's something other than just me that exists in the world. Mm-hmm. That is the aim of that chapter. And
it seems kind of aimed at this Husserlian picture that all we really know is our phenomenology,
right?
And everything else is really just a castle in a cloud or something like that. But how
which I actually don't. I mean, for the purpose of that chapter, I kind of take the Husserlian Cartesian starting point as my own starting point. Although in my earlier work, I don't agree with that at all. And in fact, I don't agree with that at all. So this chapter is dialectically working at variance with some of my other views. But you're right about taking that Husserlian starting point. Yeah.
And how do you propose to break through that very, very thick wall?
Right. So in that chapter, I do 3 experiments with the help of Alan Moore, who was one of my graduate students at the time.
Alan Moore?
No, not the famous Alan Moore.
Okay, I was going to say. Whoa.
I mean,
Okay.
He should be famous. He should be the famous Alan Moore.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Are these 3 thought experiments? I take it.
No, they're actual experiments. They're actual experiments with actual data and statistical tests. Cool. Right.
Okay.
There were 2. I was at an APA meeting with Alan, and we were like, wouldn't it be cool if you had like scientific p-values that the external world exists And it wouldn't be fun to write a collaborative paper about solipsism. So the idea of the paper, which eventually became the chapter with further revisions, was kind of this idea for a fun project of like collaboratively trying to convince me that the external world exists, including him, right? And could he do it? And could we do it with like actual scientific experiments? So what we do is we try 3 scientific experiments, and I won't describe all 3. The second one in particular is really complicated to explain, and I've found that people have a lot of trouble understanding it. But the first and third are a little easier. So in the first experiment, basically what I do is I create what seems to be a program in Microsoft Excel that will determine whether 4-digit numbers are prime or non-prime. I generate a fresh set of 4-digit numbers, and then I guess. Is this one prime? Is this one prime? Is this one prime? I do that for 20 numbers. And then I run this seeming Excel program. Now, I don't assume that Excel actually exists, that there actually isn't a program or anything like that. I just do what seems to me to be kind of the experience of doing this seeming thing in my head of dragging down the prime number function. And lo and behold, it lists the various numbers as prime or non-prime. And then through laborious hand calculation, I figure out that it is almost entirely correct. So it seems like there must be some explanation for how I experienced the word prime and word non-prime next to these various numbers in a way that actually correlated with their primeness or non-primeness, even though at the moment my best guess didn't align very well with their being prime or non-prime. The best explanation I propose for that experience of seeing prime next to all and only the prime numbers is that something in the world can calculate prime numbers better than I can do so in my own experience. And then I go through various possible alternative explanations. This experiment isn't decisive on its own, but I do think the easiest, most straightforward explanation of it, if we're open-minded about solipsism, rather than being committed solipsists or closed-minded about it, is to say, well, look, it seems like the best explanation is like maybe there is something out there that's like better than I am at figuring out what prime numbers are. Then I do a couple other experiments. The kind of the third and final experiment is I play speed chess with Alan, and he basically kicks my butt. And the best explanation for why it is that I'm having these experiences of like, wow, that was a clever move that I wasn't expecting, is that there's something in the world besides that's better than me at chess that is set on defeating me. Even if this was a dream, you know, I could imagine a dream of being defeated by a chess master. You know, but the thing about a dream is those chess moves won't be real and clever in the same kind of way, right? I'll have a vague sense that I'm being defeated, but I'm not capable of dreaming up a real chess master's play, right? Any more than I'm capable of dreaming up the proof of Fermat's last theorem, right? I could like dream that I wrote a bunch of lines and I proved Fermat's last theorem, right? But it wouldn't it wouldn't hold up, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the chess and a similar thing for if I dreamed of being beaten by a chess master, right? So these concrete specific moves that regularly surprise me, despite my best efforts, right? The best explanation for that appears to be that there's this thing in the world, Alan, or maybe a computer program, or maybe the Matrix, or something, but something out there is better than me at chess, right? So what we try to do in the chapter is just do that rigorously, right? Really think about, okay, look, if we're being open-minded about solipsism, what could the solipsists say? What kinds of possible scientific responses could the solipsist give? How can we think through those responses, right? So try to give solipsism a chance to instead of just kind of casually say, as most people who favor inference to the best explanation style responses to solipsism, they just say, solipsists couldn't explain that. That's kind of what Russell does, just kind of casual, right? We try to
Mm-hmm.
give the solipsist really a fair chance, and then work through, okay, here's what the solipsist would have to say as a scientific explanation for this pattern of results, right? When you think about it, it doesn't seem very plausible, but worth trying another experiment to see if we can angle in on that a little better. That's the spirit of it.
No, no, I really like that a lot. I mean, for if you wanted to maintain the solipsistic position in the face of an argument like this, you would really have to provide a quite a drastic re-understanding of what the mind is. I mean,
Yeah,
compared to our our contemporary scientific understanding of it, to explain how there could be all of these regularities or maybe sensible complexities like a chess match out there that you the Husserlian phenomenological subject has no way of constructing yourself.
right. I mean, one way to think about it too is think about like a scientific theory when it's in trouble, right? It kind of it predicts one thing from the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence comes out a different way. It comes up with excuses. It gets more complicated. It gets more implausible. And it's kind of like comes up with ad hoc explanations for why everything must be the case. And it's really complex, right? That's the sign of a theory in trouble, right? And I think that's the position that Alan and I kind of put solipsism in through this series of experiments and discussions of what could the solipsist say. There's always something the solipsist could say, but it just gets so convoluted and complicated. Right? By scientific standards, you're just like, okay, this just looks like a theory that's not cutting it.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we're on the topic about experimenting, you wrote a very well-known paper about the relationship between whether one is a moral philosopher and whether they actually act more morally than the rest of the population at large. Can we talk a bit about that and
Sure.
what the experiments or experiment that you performed were?
Right. I've done a bunch of experiments on that. I think overall I've got something like 17 different main measures and a
Okay,
bunch of
great.
sub-measures. It's over a series of papers. Most of the papers are collaborative with Joshua Rust, who is a former graduate student of mine and is a professor of philosophy at Stetson University. Alan Moore is a professor at San Francisco State, by the way, now. So, right. So Josh and I were interested in the question of whether people who study ethics behave any differently or more ethically than other people. And no one had ever studied that systematically before. Right? People have opinions. You ask people, ethicists and non-ethicists, other philosophers, other people in academia. Everyone's got an opinion. And it's an interesting question. I mean, I think most people do. It's kind of interesting, right? And a lot of the people think it's obvious that they wouldn't or that they do, or but no one ever really looked at it systematically. So we decided to look at it as systematically as we could, right? Do people who study ethics, does it have any effect on their behavior that we can measure, right? Do people who study ethics actually behave any ethically better than comparison groups, right? And you got to choose the right comparison group. I think the right comparison group, there are two comparison groups that we normally use. One is other professors of philosophy who don't specialize in ethics. Then the other comparison group we sometimes use is professors in departments other than philosophy at the same universities, right? So by looking at those comparison groups, you're looking at people who differ in their level of exposure to philosophical ethics, but who are going to be similar in level of education, in income, in social background, and lots of other stuff. Right. So what we found over and over again, with a couple exceptions, which are worth going into if you're interested, is that ethicists don't behave any differently than the comparison groups. Not better, not worse. Just kind of the same. The most striking result for me about this concerned vegetarianism. So what we found was on some issues, ethicists have more stringent moral views or more demanding moral views, right? So ethicists were more likely than were other professors to say that it's morally bad regularly to eat the meat of mammals. That was the way we phrased our vegetarianism question. There are various ways you could phrase a question like that, no perfect way. So they were more likely to say it's bad regularly to eat the meat of mammals. But when we asked them to self-report, did you eat the meat of a mammal at your previous evening meal, not including snacks, they reported having eaten meat at about the same rate as did our comparison groups. So we found a pretty big difference in opinion. 60% of the ethicists said it was bad versus 45% of the non-ethicist philosophers and 19% of the non-philosophers, professors in departments other than philosophy. So 60, 45, 19. Pretty big difference. Did you eat the meat of a mammal at your previous evening meal? I think 37% of ethicists said yes, and 38% of respondents overall. It was a little lower for the non-ethicist philosophers, maybe low 30s, a little higher for the professors in departments other than philosophy. Anyway, no big statistical difference. So pretty big difference in opinion, not much difference in self-reported behavior. So I think that's kind of interesting, right? So ethicists are more likely to say, oh, that's bad to eat meat, but then they go ahead and eat meat anyway. I should say, though, when I say this, so there was a follow-up study done several years later in Germany that did find that ethicists reported eating less meat at their previous evening meals, as well as having more stringent moral views. So, so maybe they do a little bit, but maybe not as much as you would think, given their difference in opinion. But anyway, overall, what we found over and over again was very little difference in behavior between ethicists and non-ethicists.
This I find very surprising, which, I mean, well, maybe you didn't. Maybe you were one of those people who didn't expect to find a difference. But just based on introspection, it surprises me because I feel that the more that I think about moral issues, and again, this is subjectively measured, maybe other people who know me don't think that this is the outcome, but I at least feel that I act much more morally. So I find this surprising.
I find it surprising in a way also, right? Because I think it is pretty compelling phenomenologically and anecdotally that sometimes you think about ethical issues, you change your minds about things, and then you put them into then you live according to it, right? I mean, and we chose vegetarianism in part because that's one of the strongest cases for this, right? There are lots of people who say, yeah, I read Peter Singer, I read James Rachel's, the arguments for not eating meat, not eating factory farm meat are compelling, and so I stopped eating meat. A lot of people say that. And it would be really strange if that was just systematically wrong. Mm-hmm. So that was partly why we thought vegetarianism would be kind of the best chance for finding a kind of a real effect. And we do have, actually, there's another study we did where there does seem to be kind of effect. So maybe sometimes it happens for vegetarianism. We can talk about that. We found some effects with students. But, right, so lots of other stuff like honesty, right? I read Kant, I decided I shouldn't lie. I should be more honest, right? That's kind of fuzzy. And, is that really, do people who study Kant's ethics, are they really less likely to lie? That I feel like, I don't know. But when someone says, look, I read Singer and I went from eating meat to not eating meat, I don't think they're lying. I think that probably really did happen if that's what they say. So, yeah, I find it somewhat surprising, especially for the more concrete issues, especially vegetarianism and charitable giving, that we don't see much or very consistent effect.
And was there a philosophical, or did you offer a philosophical explanation to what you found, or was this purely to satisfy a curiosity and it was just something maybe you wrote a a blog post to share results, or
It
how did
started,
you deal with the
yeah,
results?
it started partly as just curiosity because it's an interesting issue and it seemed like someone ought to study it,
Very much.
right? It also
Yeah,
started
yeah.
partly out of my interest in classical Chinese philosophy. Um, I I'm one of the things that I'm interested in classical
Very nice
Chinese.
background, by the way.
Oh,
Though
thank you.
that might be Japanese.
Yeah. One of the things I'm interested in classical Chinese philosophy is the debate between Mengzi and Shunzi about whether human nature is good. And Mengzi says human nature is good. And what he means by that, in my interpretation, is something like if you stop and reflect and really kind of authentically think about moral issues and how to treat the people around you will find yourself drawn to do what's morally good and revolted by what's evil. And what you need to do in order to develop morally is kind of think, reflect, notice these reactions that you have of like, yeah, it feels good to help somebody. Yeah, it feels yucky to like steal someone's umbrella or something, right? You notice that it feels yucky to be bad and it feels good to be nice, right? And you cultivate that. And right, so in this Mentian picture, you'd think that there'd
So
be a
wait, you said
relationship.
Mencius? Am I
Yeah,
right that we refer to him as Mencius or
right.
Mencius?
Mencius or
The
Mengzi.
anglicization.
Right, there's
Okay.
two
Okay.
anglizations for the same guy. Mencius is the kind of older one, and Mengzi is the more contemporary one.
What does that say about how Confucius is in Chinese? Do you know?
Do I know what about Confucius?
Well, I'm guessing that if Mencius is the anglicization of
Right,
Mengzi, Confucius is the anglicization of something else, and I'd
Kongzi.
never thought about that before.
Kongzi
Oh,
or
okay, great.
Kongfuzi. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Oh, well, okay. I'm sorry for cutting
Yeah.
you off.
Right.
Please
So,
continue.
right. So, I don't think it necessarily follows from Mengzi's view, um, but the part of me that's drawn to Mencius thinks, look, and part of me that's drawn to ancient ethics in general, I think in the Western tradition also, is like, isn't an important part of ethics to like reflect and think about what's good and like try to become better as a result and see what's good and what's right and do those things? And could you really make intellectual progress in thinking about what's good and right and not have any motivation to change or kind of become that way? Is there some kind of failure if you're doing ethics in this completely abstract way that has no positive impact on your life? That kind of more ancient vision of ethics is attractive to me. Right. So, I mean, not that I think there's also room for weird abstract meta ethics articles and stuff like that. That's fine. Right. But like most of us who teach ethics, it's not just all about trolley problems and meta ethics. I mean, you also teach students about racism and sexism and charitable giving and vegetarianism and honesty and all those kinds of things that have real impact, that are relevant to your life decisions, and shouldn't thinking about that have some impact on what you do? And wouldn't it be weird if it didn't? So
Uh,
yeah, so that's kind of the frame of mind that I was coming at this from. But I thought, because that was my background theoretical inclination, but then I saw people who were ethicists in my life, and they seemed like ordinary, right? They didn't seem especially good or especially bad. It seemed like they're just kind of a mix of normal, kind of nerdy intellectual people, right? So I thought there's something incongruous there. What's really going on?
so while we're talking about Mengzi, you mentioned that you were interested about in his debate with another person named, I think, Zhang Shi, and I don't think
Shunzi,
that's
yeah.
Kongzhi, which is Confucius.
Kongzi.
If I under
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
okay,
Yeah, I know they're a little hard to pronounce, but
yeah. So
yeah.
what did the second one? I won't pronounce his name. What did he have to say on human nature, and how did
Shunzi.
his Shunzi, how did his uh, dispute or disagreement or argument or debate with Mengzi
Mengzi.
manifest itself. Mengzi.
Mengzi
Mengzi.
Shunzi. Right. So I think when
Shunzi.
you're pronouncing foreign words, the thing that I like to do is just get as close as you can with English phonemes, right? So you don't need to try to like get the tones right or whatever, right? But with English phonemes, with Mengzi, it's like think of it as like Mungtzu. Mengzi, right? And Shunzi, it's like Shuntzu. Shunzi, right? And Kongzi, Kongtzu, right? Kongzi, something like that, right? And that's not how they're actually spelled, right? In the current Anglicization, but that's kind of, think about it, pronouncing them that way, right? So Mengzi versus Shunzi. So Shunzi thinks that he has a surprisingly secular kind of modern view for someone from ancient China. It's really interesting. One of the things that I think that you learn by looking at ancient Chinese philosophy, not in a super casual way, just reading a few of the very most famous texts, but by like looking at it a little more deeply, is that there's a lot of diversity in it, and there are a lot of different types of views represented, and this kind of picture that you see of like, here's how Eastern people think, here's how Western people think, is way too simple. Right? But Shunzi is this really interesting kind of modern, almost modern in some ways, philosopher who thinks that morality is basically an artificial social construction. He says, ancient people figured out what kinds of social structures led to an orderly society. And morality is basically teaching the next generation those social structures. And people have no attraction to behaving in those ways. What people want naturally is like, pleasure and fun and good tasting food and sex and power and all that kind of stuff, right? You kind of have to force them to abide by these social structures that we've discovered make society run well. And if you just let them follow their inclinations, it's going to be chaos, right? So he's got this really kind of secular social structure view of morality.
Well, that was all very fascinating, very cool to listen to. It's always nice to learn more about the philosophy in other cultures, since we're very West-centric in our philosophy departments. I just talked to Peter Adamson about Islamic philosophy at length, and that was really great. But returning to the question that all this emerged from, are you vegetarian?
No. I'm an example of the kind of ethicist that I'm talking about, right? I think at this point I've done enough ethics that I think that in some sense, although it's not my main focus, I kind of am an ethicist by the standards that I apply. And right, I kind of, my behavior is kind of the modal normal thing, right? I think it is a little morally bad. I don't think it's extremely bad. I think it is a little morally bad, non-ideal to eat the meat of mammals or eat factory farmed animals. And yet I do continue to do it.
Well, then now really returning full circle, we started off the cyberpunk discussion that turned into all these other things and then ended up with vegetarianism. But we started off by talking about The Matrix, and I mentioned that it's one of my absolute favorite movies. And before we move on, I'm just curious if there are other aspects of The Matrix that you find philosophically compelling that we didn't touch
on. No, it's really that main idea is the idea of this artificial reality is the one that I find most interesting from The Matrix. I haven't even seen all of the Matrix movies. I'm not a big Matrix nut, so I couldn't get into the exact details of how it all works. Okay, my taste in Cyberpunk is a little more Greg Egan and William Gibson.
Gibson.
Yeah, Neil Stephenson.
So you have. Then maybe I guess we'll return back to animals, but yeah. You have a chapter about whether there's something it's like to be a garden snail.
Oh, and
you pressed me a little bit when I talked about there being a narrative center of some sort to
Yeah.
a rabbit. So I'm curious about how you approached the garden snail in particular.
Garden snails are really interesting
Oh,
for a couple
great.
reasons. So I think they're a really interesting test case for thinking about animal consciousness because people's intuitions diverge. Right, we're talking about common sense as a starting point, right? So, one of the themes
For
of the weirdness
weirdness.
of the
Yeah,
world
yeah.
is that common sense is going to mess up, right? But still, I think it's got to be a starting point for philosophy or any area where you don't know what you're doing. You kind of start with common sense. That's the default position, and then you see what happens, right? When you start from common sense, like everybody thinks you got a cat in your lap, right? Everybody thinks cats are conscious. I mean, there are a few nutty philosophers who have some doubts, right? But basically, we all think cats have conscious experience, right? And most people don't think that bacteria are conscious or trees, although there are some people who do think that. But when we're talking about common sense, cats are in and bacteria are out. But garden snails, people are mixed. I would say, based on just the kind of informal asking around, in my social circles and my subculture, maybe 3/4 of people will say, "Oh yeah, garden snails. I think they have experiences. I think they can feel pain or, taste things." And about 25% are like, "No, they're basically just plants. They don't have any experience. They don't have a sense of self, or, there's no phenomenological center going on there." Right. So opinions are. It's not a kind of obvious commonsensical from a commonsensical point of view. It's not an obvious yes or no. So that makes an interesting case in thinking about animal consciousness questions. So they're interesting in that way. The other way they're interesting is they're weird. So
Okay.
they've got,
In our colloquial sense of weird, or
well, kind of in both senses, really.
okay.
So their central nervous system is only 60,000 neurons. That's
Okay.
tiny, like an ant.
A little more than a nematode,
Yeah.
but very tiny. Yeah.
It's like an ant's got 250,000. So it's like,
Oh,
yeah,
oh wow,
it's a lot less than an ant.
that is very surprising.
And furthermore, these neurons that they have in the central nervous system, they're in kind of clumps of ganglia around their esophagus. And they're not even all that interconnected.
Oh, quite bizarre.
So I haven't found.
They're like the United States of animals.
kind of. I don't know, right? Now they do have a lot of peripheral neurons. They've got like maybe 250,000 one-way peripheral neurons, especially from their posterior tentacles that terminate.
So nerves here.
Yeah, input nerves, right? But we don't usually
Yeah.
think input nerves are where consciousness happens, right? It happens in the central nervous system normally, right? So so there's that. Like most of their nerves are in their posterior tentacles instead of, well, they don't even really have brains, but they got clumps of nerves around their esophagus, right? At the same time, they engage in some pretty sophisticated behavior for having so few central nervous system neurons. Like they have home ranges. They'll like have homes where they nest, and they will wander around through their home range and then come back to their nesting place. And if you displace them, throw them, right? 10 meters away, they'll find their way back. And they're not just doing it by kind of, if you think about like single cell entities they'll tumble, and they'll move toward attractive things and away from, but they don't have like systematic exploration, right? Where snails have that. The other thing is like their sex is really complicated. They are simultaneous,
like their sexual intercourse,
their sexual behavior.
or
Their sexual intercourse is really complicated. They're simultaneous hermaphrodites, right? So they have both female and male genitalia. If you pick up a snail, you might be like, wait, where's the penis?
Yeah.
It's like there's this. Basically,
exactly
you might think of think of it as the side of the neck. There's like this pouch in there that is normally inside the body, and then it kind of comes out, right? And there's a penis and a vagina in this pouch, right? When they're sexually aroused.
Convenient.
Right. So mating takes about, on average, like 7 hours. Right. So what you get is you get two snails, and they'll contact each other. and then pull away, and they'll kind of taste each other's slime trails, and then like either continue the mating thing or break away, right? They'll kind of touch or kiss their front tentacles. Sometimes they'll take little bites out of each other, and then they'll shoot love
Erotic.
darts. They'll shoot love darts at each other, right? So these are centimeter long arrows made of calcium covered in mucus, and they'll shoot them at each other, and like they hit about half the time or a third of the time, right? When they hit, it's not hitting in the vagina or anywhere. It's just like going into the skin, right? They shoot love darts at each other, sometimes hit, sometimes miss, right? The mating kind of continues. They try over and over again to insert their penises into each other's vaginas, and mating culminates when they manage to do that simultaneously. And then they kind of transfer each to the other a spermatophore, which is like sperms plus nutrients. The receiving snail will then like basically digest almost all of the sperm.
Well, they're both receiving, right?
They're both receiving, right? So they'll each digest, like just eat basically most of the sperm that they received, and they'll do this then several times, typically, right? And then after they've mated several times, they'll dig a shallow hole in the soil with their heads, and they'll ovulate down into the soil and deposit eggs from their various mates. Now, mates whose darts have hit, more of the eggs will have been fertilized by the mates whose darts have hit, right? So one of the theories is that the mucus on the darts protects the sperm of the shooter from being digested at as high a rate as it would have been had the dart missed. So then they ovulate down into the soil in this hole that they dig, and then they cover it up, and then they leave, right? So this is super complicated.
Yeah, I never thought
60,000 central nervous system neurons, and they're doing this.
Mm-hmm. I never thought I'd find softcore snail porn narration so enthralling. I think you should really consider writing a romance novel.
You should see some of my science fiction. Slightly strange sex is not an uncommon theme in my science fiction.
Nice. I'm sure you waited till you had tenure before
yes,
you wrote
I
those
did,
ones.
actually. Yeah, I did.
Now, so what then? So you've made a very good case for this being weird, and I'm curious how you developed the philosophical discussion around this question of whether or not they're conscious.
So here's the kind of core argument. Prior to developing a theory about consciousness, I don't think it's obvious, or should be obvious, whether garden snails are or are not conscious based on the description I just gave. It's kind of attractive to think that they might be conscious, right? And the more complicated the behavior, you start to relate to them, and like in my heart, I kind of like hope and think maybe they're conscious. Maybe that's where I would bet if I really had to. But
you don't want anybody to be missing out on that,
right? But man, you could also like current computers can do pretty sophisticated things, and toy robots can do pretty sophisticated things, and your enteric nervous system, your gut, is lined with 500 million neurons, way more than a garden snail, as many as a small mammal, right? Just line your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines, and control digestion, right? And it can operate even when it's severed from the central nervous system. We don't normally think that your enteric nervous system is a source of consciousness, right? So there's like, you can have pretty complicated behavior, you can have pretty big neural systems that, it's, at least most people would say, are not conscious, right? So maybe the snail's kind of like that. Maybe it's kind of not conscious like we think a toy robot is not conscious, or it's not conscious like we think a computer isn't conscious, or it's not conscious like we think the enteric nervous system isn't conscious. I think that's a reasonable point of view. It's also a reasonable point of view to think, well, maybe they are conscious, right? We could give an argument. We could kind of give the intuitive argument for that if you want, but I don't want to get too much into that because we only have so much time, and I think that's where people are a little bit more drawn anyway. So I think you could come up either way, kind of on kind of armchair intuitive grounds, right? So if we're going to settle the question of Snail consciousness, we need a theory. We need a good theory of consciousness to apply to the case. But then here's the problem. To develop a theory of consciousness to apply to the case, you need to make some background assumptions about approximately what kinds of things are conscious. Right? Some theories of consciousness that you see on the market by philosophers or neuroscientists or psychologists or computer scientists are plainly liberal in the sense that they're going to let lots of things count as conscious. Other theories are plainly conservative in the sense that they're going to require really sophisticated cognitive structures for something to be conscious. So you have one of these liberal theories that says basically, well, as long as you've got a body and you can kind of distinguish your own body from the environment and not eat yourself and kind of have a sense of position, right? Then you're conscious, right? Something like that. Merker's theory, maybe. Then plainly on that kind of theory, garden snails are going to be conscious, right? Or if you take a theory that where consciousness requires some kind of sophisticated self-representation, like a higher order thought theory, garden snails are not going to be engaged in higher order thought, right? They don't have representations of their own minds, probably, right? So what's going to happen is, in order to develop a general theory of consciousness, you're going to need to make some background assumptions about, in broad strokes at least, what kinds of things in the universe are conscious and what kinds of things aren't. And as soon as you do that, you've begged the question one way or another about garden snails. So we start in ignorance about the consciousness of garden snails, and then we end up in ignorance because we've got a bunch of theories, and how attracted you are to the various theories is going to partly depend, to a substantial extent, depend on your prior opinions about whether things like garden snails are sophisticated enough to have consciousness. So it's going to just basically kind of end up in a circle, kind of like Agrippa says, right?
That's exactly where I was going to go with that.
So I don't think that we have enough common ground. I call this the common ground problem. I got it. There's some other complexities to this, right? But just one of the problems, I call it the common ground problem, right? In a lot of areas in philosophy, there's a lot of common ground, right? So if you look at, say, epistemology, there's a lot of common ground about like what counts as an instance of knowledge or an instance of ignorance, what counts as a good justification, what counts as a bad justification. There's of course disputes, right? But basically there's a lot of agreement about straightforward cases, and the disputes are where the interesting fights are, right? But there's a lot of common ground. Or if you look at ethics, there's a lot of common ground. Another thing I think you can learn by looking at ancient Chinese ethics is you read Confucius and it's like, this all fits, common sense, right? It's not like reading some alien document. This is as far as you can get from contemporary Western culture and have a large written body of ethical documents, right? Is basically ancient China, right? It's as far as you can get culturally from us. You read Confucius and you're like, yeah, I basically agree with almost all of this. It seems pretty commonsensical, right? So of course there are lots of disputes in ethics, but there's so much common ground. But that's what we don't have in common. So philosophers can resolve things because they can appeal to the common ground and kind of figure out what's going on in the middle. In consciousness, there just isn't that common ground, right? You go all the way from some people who are panpsychists who think consciousness is ubiquitous, consciousness is everywhere in the universe, literally everything is conscious, right? This is an increasingly common view, right? To people like Peter Carruthers, Dan Dennett, who are like, humans are conscious, apes and dogs maybe, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought Daniel Dennett would say that, but I'm not disputing.
He's a little, he's a little cagey about it. There are moments where he seems to be saying that, and there are other moments where he's not. I find him a little bit confusing on that. And Carruthers also has shifted his view over time on this a little bit. So I think the best way to characterize both Dennett and Carruthers is like, not totally clear on whether dogs and apes are conscious, definitely not going to go all the way to snails for sure, right? Right.
Yeah,
If you
yeah.
got doubts even about dogs and apes, right? So, um, right. So that's huge, huge, huge difference
Mhm.
in starting opinions about consciousness. We're not gonna find the common ground. If you, any theory of consciousness you're going to be attracted to, you're going to be attracted to partly, to a substantial extent, because it fits your initial inclinations about broadly how widespread consciousness in the universe. Right? If
Mhm.
you've got really liberal inclinations, you're not going to like, you know, higher order thought theories, and you're not going to like, you know, views where you need to have a narrative self or something like that, right? Whereas if you've got much more liberal views, um, you're going to have no problem with snail consciousness.
Yeah, I think Dennett actually has a book called From Bacteria to Bach, and I think he's going to say Bach is conscious, bacteria not. And as you mentioned, if somebody's not going to allow dogs or apes, they're certainly not. Well, maybe not certainly, but probably pretty certainly not going to allow a snail, and definitely not a
Yeah.
bacterium. But you mentioned that at the beginning, I think at the outset, that even you're probably going to write off the consciousness of a bacterium. So, and if I'm putting words into your
Yeah, no,
mouth,
that's my
uh,
inclination, right? I am on the skeptical side, so I don't totally rule out panpsychism. One thing I wish people did more as philosophers was just have a little more sense of what we might think of as their credence space. Like,
mhm.
you can invest a little bit of credence in positions that you think are not likely to be true.
Well, here is where I was going to. Oh, if
Yeah.
you wanted to continue.
So like panpsychism, I think it's probably not true. It's definitely not where my bet is. But that doesn't mean that I just think it's absurd and I don't think there's any chance that it could be true. So I think, it's healthy. And one of the things that I hope for in my book on weirdness, actually, right, is to do what I call disjunctive metaphysics. A disjunction is a series of statements connected by the word or. This or that or that or that might be true, right? So, like, think about what possibilities there are that are worth a little bit of, like, okay, this could be true. Maybe it's not where my money is, but it could be true. Maybe it's worth a 5% credence or a 10% credence, right? So why not have panpsychism there, say, with, 5% of your credence or something like that? That's how I think about
The reason that I stressed the bacteria and was going to talk more about that is I actually recently just got Twitter maybe a couple of weeks ago, and you were one of the first people I followed. And according to Twitter, you recently gave I'm going to quote, a defense of the intrinsic moral value of alien microbes in the solar system, should any exist, even if they lack sentience.
it. Yes.
And I'm curious about what that is and why you're distinguishing moral value from our microbes.
Yeah. Right. This started when I was invited by NASA and the Library of Congress to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with NASA scientists to talk about the ethics of exploring the solar system. And there are a lot of NASA scientists who think that it's not unlikely that we will find microbial life. Icy moons are the hot thing now, not Mars. I mean, maybe Mars is too dry, right? But um, under the surface of the ice of Europa, in maybe the warm oceans in Europa, right? Maybe, or other icy moons, right? So there's a lot of scientists who think, hey, there's a decent chance. There's a pretty good chance. Some scientists think it's quite likely in the next 10 years that we will find microbial life in the solar system. There's also there's also a whole series of approaches where you look for evidence of life on distant stars, on planets around distant stars, by looking for signs of gases in planetary systems that are likely only to exist if there were life on that planet, right? So that's a whole other research strand, right? But there are people in NASA who think, there's a decent chance we're going to find evidence of microbial life. So one of the things that we're talking about at this meeting was, okay, well, let's say we found microbes on Mars or on Europa. Like, what's our attitude toward that? And some people seem to have a very exploitative attitude. Like, well, great, let's do some science, right? And, let's, they'd be fascinating to study. We don't have any particular ethical obligations not to disturb them, right? And there were some other people who were like, man, if you find life on another planet, let it be. Don't touch it, right? If you know Star Trek, right? Kind of the prime directive, right? Don't mess with life from another planet, right? Let it be its thing. And I found myself with a moderate version of the latter view, right? Thinking, if there are microbes on another planet, my inclination is to think we should not treat them as casually as we treat the microbes in our own bodies, like when we take antibiotics, right? I don't feel any guilt about taking antibiotics, but man, if there's one patch of life on Mars and our probe lands there and blasts it and wipes it out, and now life is extinguished on Mars, I'd be like, I wouldn't want that. That'd be way worse in my mind, ethically, than taking antibiotics. So why is that? It's not because I think microbes are conscious. And it's not because, more subtly, right? Some people said, well, they might not be conscious now, but it could be that microbial life would eventually become conscious life, and we've got to give it the chance to evolve, right? That's a reasonable thing to think, right? But I guess I'm not thinking that as the only reason that we might care about microbial life, right? My inclination is to think that there's something intrinsically valuable about life on another planet that's worth respecting. And that is kind of just an intuition. I don't really have an argument for it other than to just kind of state it and invite you to agree, right? Not everyone's going to agree, but I think a lot of us, when we think about it, me at least, some of my friends and maybe you, right, think, there's some pull in that. Well, here's one way to think about it. Here's one way to kind of just massage the intuitions a little bit. I think of this as the distant planet thought experiment. Imagine there's some planet far away from us on the other side of the galactic core. We'll never interact with it. We'll never see it. No connection with it whatsoever. Right? Kind of, what would you hope for from that planet? What would be good for that planet? Was it good if it's a sterile rock? Or would it be better in some way? Would the universe somehow be better if that planet had life on it? And I'm inclined to think, yeah, the universe would be better if that planet had life on it. Not anything to do with our interests or the interests of any conscious organisms, right? Just the universe is richer, more wonderful, more awesome, in virtue of having life on its planets.
Awesome. Well, on that note, then, I'll just ask one last question for my own curiosity. We started off by talking about what a prolific author you are, and I think the conversation shows what a diverse thinker you are. I'm curious, what are your writing and work habits like that you're able to put out so much?
I love to write. A lot of people do other stuff and procrastinate the writing. I write and procrastinate the other stuff. Like this week, I wrote a new science fiction story. I'm supposed to be doing all this other stuff. I'm kind of irresponsible with some of my other stuff, but I really I wanted to write this story. I think for me, it's I want to write. I just, it's my priority. I carve out the time to do it, and I work other things around it. So it's like it drives me.
So
It's not a particular habit or schedule or discipline or anything like that. It's kind of the undiscipline of just like, now I'm going to do what I want to do.
so is it? It's not painful for you then
No, I love writing.
to write.
I love writing.
Okay, no, that's amazing. That's great. Okay, well, what a great way to end this. Thanks so much for joining me. This was really fascinating on all levels.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a fun chat.